Colorado Territory, 1879. The mining town of Silver Peak clung to the mountainside like a desperate man to his last dollar. Harsh winters and harsher men had carved this settlement from wilderness, leaving little room for tenderness in a place where survival demanded everything. The late summer air hung heavy with promise and peril, just like everything else on the frontier. Thomas Keller believed the West was no place for a man to open his heart. At 25, he'd already witnessed how quickly the land could take everything. His father to Apache raiders when he was 12, his mother to pneumonia 2 winters later, and his brother to a cattle rustler's bullet just last spring. The rough calluses on his hands matched the ones he'd grown around his heart, and he preferred it that way. A man alone was a man who couldn't be hurt again. You planning to stare at that whiskey all night, or actually drink it? Samuel, the grizzled bartender at the Silver Dollar Saloon, slid a rag across the worn bar top. Thomas glanced up, his blue eyes clear despite the exhaustion etched across his sun-bronzed face. Just resting a moment before heading back to the ranch. Suit yourself. Samuel moved on to serve the miners fresh off their shift, men desperate to wash away the mountain's dust with something stronger than water. Thomas had ridden into town for supplies and to deposit the modest earnings from his small cattle operation at the bank. His ranch was nothing grand, 40 acres with a struggling herd and a cabin he'd built himself, but it was his. He needed nothing and no one else. Or so he told himself each night when the coyotes' lonely howls echoed his own isolation. What he wanted was simple, to build something lasting in a land that took more than it gave. What he needed, though he'd deny it even to himself, was the very thing he feared most, connection that made life worth the struggle. The saloon doors swung open, admitting a shaft of late afternoon sunlight that momentarily blinded everyone inside. Thomas squinted against the glare, then froze, glass halfway to his lips. In that golden light stood a young woman unlike any he'd seen in Silver Peak. Her chestnut brown hair was swept up beneath a modest bonnet, with wayward curls framing a face both delicate and determined. Her traveling dress, dusty from the road but clearly of fine Eastern quality, was the deep blue of mountain columbines. She couldn't have been more than 22, yet something in her posture spoke of someone accustomed to handling difficulty. As the light faded and the saloon returned to its permanent dusk, Thomas watched her scan the room with intelligent hazel eyes. When her gaze briefly met his, something electric and unfamiliar jolted through him. The woman, approached the bar, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her. No respectable woman entered a frontier saloon unescorted. Yet she moved with purpose, clutching a small leather satchel close to her side. "I'm looking for Mr. Jenkins," she announced to Samuel, her voice cultured but firm. "I was told he might be found here." Samuel's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Old Henry Jenkins? Mining company man. Yes, I have business with him regarding my father's claim." Before Samuel could respond, a burly man with a red beard laughed from his card table. "Business, she says. What sort of business would a pretty little thing like you have with Jenkins?" Thomas felt his muscles tense as several men chuckled. The woman's chin lifted slightly, but he caught the momentary flash of uncertainty in her eyes. "Sir, my business is my own." Her voice remained steady, though Thomas noted how her knuckles whitened around her satchel. The bearded man rose, swaying slightly from drink. "Now, don't be unfriendly. New faces are rare enough round here, especially ones as pretty as yours." Thomas found himself on his feet before he'd made the conscious decision to move. "Jenkins left for Denver yesterday," he said, stepping between the woman and the miner. "Won't be back for at least a week." The woman turned to him, surprise and wariness mingling in her expression. "And you are?" "Thomas Keller. I run cattle just outside town." He tipped his hat slightly, keeping his peripheral vision on the red-bearded miner. "Miss Amelia Ashford." She hesitated, clearly weighing her options. "My father was Elijah Ashford." Recognition flickered across Samuel's weathered face. "The professor? Heard he passed last winter. Sorry for your loss, miss." Thomas noted how her shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of her father. "Thank you." He spoke often of Silver Peak and his interests here. "I've come to settle his affairs." The red-bearded miner snorted. "If you're after the Silverado claim, you're wasting your time. That mine played out years ago. Nevertheless, it remains my responsibility to address my father's investments. Her tone brooked no argument, though Thomas saw the weariness beneath her composure. An older miner at the bar cleared his throat. Jenkins is staying at the Mountain View Hotel when he's in town. Might leave a message for him there. Thank you. She nodded gratefully, then turned back to Thomas. Mr. Keller, I appreciate your intervention, unnecessary though it was. Thomas should have tipped his hat and returned to his whiskey. A woman with business and mining claims meant complications, and complications meant trouble. But something, perhaps the shadow of vulnerability beneath her proud bearing, made him speak. Town's not safe for a lady alone after dark. If you're headed to the hotel, I'd be happy to escort you. The offer surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. For a moment, she studied him, as if weighing his character in a single glance. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her. That would be most kind, Mr. Keller. Outside, the mountain air carried the first hint of autumn's chill. Thomas maintained a respectful distance as they walked, aware of curious glances from townspeople. A young woman arriving alone already sparked gossip. Being seen with the solitary rancher would only add fuel. Have you traveled far, Miss Ashford? He asked, breaking the silence between them. From Boston. Nearly 3 weeks on trains and stagecoaches. A small smile touched her lips. I've never seen country so vast and empty. Some find it overwhelming. I find it. She paused, searching for the word. Honest. The land makes no pretenses about its dangers or its beauty. Thomas glanced at her with new interest. That's not how most Easterners see it. I'm not most Easterners, Mr. Keller. There was a quiet strength in her words that resonated with him unexpectedly. They reached the hotel, a 2-story wooden structure that passed for luxury in Silver Peak. Thomas removed his hat as they stopped at the entrance. Thank you for your kindness, she said, extending her gloved hand. When he took it, something peculiar happened. For the briefest moment, he felt as though he recognized her, though they'd never met before today. The sensation was so strong it nearly made him step back. Miss Ashford, if you need assistance while in town, with Jenkins or otherwise, I'm generally in town on Wednesdays for supplies. Her smile reached her eyes this time. I'll remember that, Mr. Keller. As he watched her enter the hotel, Thomas couldn't shake the strange feeling that had overcome him. Something had shifted in his carefully ordered world, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted it to shift back. 3 days later, Thomas was mending fence on the north pasture when he spotted a rider approaching. Few visitors came this far out. Most were either lost or bringing trouble. He rested his hand on the rifle propped against a fence post as the figure drew closer. To his astonishment, he recognized Amelia Ashford, though she'd exchanged her traveling dress for a practical riding skirt and jacket. Her hair was braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, protection against the mountain sun. Miss Ashford, he called as she reined her horse to a stop. This is unexpected. She dismounted with surprising ease for an Eastern woman. Mr. Keller, I hope I'm not intruding on your work. Not at all. He gestured to his half-completed fence repair. Though I'm curious what brings you all this way. Information, she said directly. About my father's claim. The hotel owner mentioned you worked at the Silverado mine before turning to ranching. Thomas frowned slightly. I did for a time. Barely more than a boy. Then you might know why my father maintained his investment in a mine that supposedly played out years ago. Her hazel eyes fixed on him intently. Mr. Jenkins is conveniently unavailable, and no one in town seems willing to discuss the Silverado openly. Thomas wiped his hands on his trousers, considering his words carefully. Mining towns run on hope and whispers, Miss Ashford. The Silverado had promise once, before a cave-in killed 3 men and spooked investors. And my father maintained his stake even after that. Professor Ashford was persistent in his beliefs. He visited only twice a year, but always seemed certain the mine would produce again. Thomas hesitated. Some thought him eccentric. A flash of defensiveness crossed her face. My father was brilliant, not eccentric. He taught geology at Harvard for 20 years. I meant no disrespect, Thomas said quietly. He was kind to me when I was working the claim, brought books, and spoke to me like I had thoughts worth hearing. Her expression softened. That sounds like him. Thomas glanced at the sky, noting the gathering clouds. Storm's coming. Would you like some coffee before you head back? It's nothing fancy, but it's hot. Amelia hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd appreciate that. Inside his cabin, Thomas moved quickly to light the stove and set water to boil, acutely aware of how bare and utilitarian his home must appear to her. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting area, with a small bedroom partitioned off at the back. Everything was clean but plain, a testament to a life built for function, not comfort. You live here alone? Amelia asked, standing just inside the door. Just me and a few good horses, Thomas replied. And a mean old barn cat, who tolerates me on account of the mice. She smiled at that, removing her hat and gloves. Thomas found himself noticing the way the light from the window caught her hair, turning the chestnut strands to gold at the edges. As the water heated, Thomas pulled out 2 tin cups and a small canister of coffee. If you don't mind my asking, what do you plan to do about your father's claim? Amelia sighed, settling onto one of the wooden chairs at the small table. Truthfully, I'm not certain. I intended to sell it and return east, but... She trailed off, looking troubled. But, Thomas prompted gently. My father's last letter mentioned a discovery, something that would vindicate years of patience. He never explained further. Her fingers traced patterns on the rough wooden tabletop. 3 weeks later, he was gone. Thomas set the coffee before her. Heart failure, I heard. So sudden. Pain flickered across her face. He was my only family. After my mother died when I was 16, it was just us. He encouraged my studies when other girls were learning only household management. You're educated then? I assisted my father in his research and attended lectures when permitted. A wry smile touched her lips. Informally, of course. Harvard doesn't admit women. The storm arrived as they talked, rain drumming against the cabin roof. Thomas found himself sharing more than he had with anyone in years, about his small ranch, his hopes to expand his herd, even bits about his family. In turn, Amelia spoke of Boston, her father's work, and her uncertain future. I should return to town, she said finally, glancing at the window where rain still fell steadily. Not in this, Thomas said firmly. Trail gets treacherous in the rain. Too easy for a horse to slip on the mountain paths. Amelia bit her lip, clearly conflicted. I can't impose. You can take my bed for the night, Thomas said, then felt his face warm at her startled expression. I meant, I'll sleep out here by the fire. No one will think twice about it with the storm. People get stranded in the mountains all the time. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. Thank you. You're very kind. That night, as Thomas lay on a bedroll near the dying embers of the fire, he found himself listening to the gentle rain and thinking about the woman asleep in the next room. Something about her presence had transformed his small cabin from merely shelter to something that felt almost like a home. It was a dangerous thought. Thomas had built his life around self-reliance, knowing attachment only led to loss in this unforgiving country. Yet something about Amelia Ashford made him wonder if his carefully constructed fortress against hurt might be missing more than it was protecting. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Thomas was already tending the horses when Amelia emerged from the cabin, her hair freshly braided and her face showing the effects of sleep. I made coffee, he said, nodding toward the pot heating on the small fire he'd built outside. And there's some bread and preserves inside. Thank you. She accepted the cup he offered, warming her hands around it. For everything. They ate a simple breakfast together, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. The air between them felt different somehow, a tentative connection formed through shared conversation and unexpected trust. I'd like to see the Silverado, Amelia said suddenly, before I make any decisions about it. Thomas looked at her in surprise. It's a half-day's ride from here. Will you take me? I'll pay for your time. I don't want your money, he said, perhaps too quickly. But the mine hasn't been properly maintained. It could be dangerous. All the more reason I need someone who knows it. Her eyes met his, determined. Please, Mr. Keller. Thomas, I need to understand what my father saw in that place. Something in her voice, the blend of vulnerability and resolve, made refusal impossible. We'll need supplies, he said finally, and to leave word in town so no one worries. Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Thank you. 3 days later, they stood at the entrance to the Silverado mine, a dark gash in the mountainside partially overgrown with scrub pine and mountain grasses. Thomas carried a lantern in one hand and had his Winchester rifle slung over his shoulder, protection against the mountain lions that sometimes sheltered in abandoned mines. It doesn't look like much, Amelia admitted, surveying the weathered timbers supporting the mine entrance. Most fortunes in the West don't start out looking like much, Thomas replied, testing the support beams carefully. These seem solid enough near the entrance, but we won't go deep. Inside, the air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and minerals. Their lantern cast long shadows against the rough-hewn walls as they moved carefully through the main shaft. My father marked this tunnel on his map, Amelia said, consulting a folded paper she'd brought from her satchel. There should be a side passage about 50 yards in. Thomas held the lantern higher. There, to the right. The side tunnel was narrower, requiring them to walk single file. Thomas went first, checking for loose rocks or unstable sections. They had gone perhaps 30 yards when the tunnel opened into a small chamber. This is it, Amelia breathed, examining her map. This is where he marked an X. Thomas raised the lantern, illuminating the chamber. At first glance, it appeared empty, just another dead end in a played-out mine. But as he moved the light slowly across the walls, something caught his eye. There, he said, pointing to a section of wall that appeared different from the surrounding rock. That vein, it's quartz. Amelia moved closer, running her gloved fingers over the pale streak in the wall. Quartz often accompanies gold deposits. Sometimes, but the Silverado was primarily silver, as the name suggests. She turned to him, eyes bright with excitement. My father's specialty was mineral formation. He had theories about certain geological indicators that could predict deeper deposits. She pulled a small geological hammer from her satchel and carefully chipped at the wall. Thomas watched, bemused by her enthusiasm. You came prepared. A professor's daughter learns to be thorough. She examined the rock fragment in her palm, then handed it to him. Look closely. He held it to the lantern light. Within the quartz, tiny flecks glinted gold in the warm glow. This vein continues behind the wall, Amelia said, tapping the rock face. The original miners followed the silver, but missed this completely. Thomas stared at the fragment in his hand, then at the woman before him, her face flushed with discovery. Your father was right. He usually was, she said softly, a mixture of pride and grief in her voice. The ride back to Thomas's ranch was filled with animated discussion. Amelia explained her father's theories, using terms Thomas only partially understood but appreciated for the passion behind them. She had a mind as sharp as any man's he'd known, sharper than most, and spoke of minerals and geological formations with the ease of someone discussing old friends. So what will you do? He asked as they neared his cabin in the fading light. Reopen the mine? Amelia's excitement dimmed slightly. I don't have the capital for such an undertaking, and a woman alone would face challenges. You could sell the claim now that you've confirmed its value, and return to Boston? She looked out at the mountains painted gold and purple in the sunset. I'm not certain that's what I want anymore. Thomas felt a strange tightness in his chest at the thought of her staying. The West isn't easy on anyone, especially women alone. I'm discovering that difficulty and impossibility are not the same thing. She met his eyes. What would you do if you were in my position? Me? Thomas considered for a moment. I'd find a partner. Someone who knows mining and the territory. Split the risk and the reward. That evening, they sat outside his cabin watching stars appear in the vast mountain sky. The air between them had changed again, filled with possibility and unspoken questions. I should return to town tomorrow, Amelia said finally. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. You haven't imposed. The words came quickly, surprising even Thomas with their earnestness. She turned to look at him, her face silvered by moonlight. When I arrived in Silver Peak, I thought I'd be here a week at most, just long enough to sell my father's claim and settle his affairs. And now I find myself. She hesitated, searching for words, reconsidering many things I thought I knew. Thomas found himself wanting to reach for her hand, but resisted. The mountains have a way of changing a person's perspective. It isn't just the mountains, she said softly. The moment hung between them, fragile and full of promise. Thomas thought of all the reasons he should maintain his distance, his vow to remain unattached, the complications she would bring to his carefully ordered life, the inevitable pain when things ended. But looking at her in the moonlight, those reasons seemed suddenly insubstantial against the reality of her presence. Before he could respond, a distant rumble of hooves broke the silence. Thomas was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Stay here," he said, voice low and urgent as he moved toward the sound. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, approaching his cabin at a canter. Thomas recognized the center figure immediately, Henry Jenkins, the mining company representative who was supposedly in Denver. "Keller," Jenkins called, reining his horse to a stop. "Unusual to find you with company." His eyes moved past Thomas to where Amelia now stood on the cabin porch. "Jenkins." Thomas kept his voice neutral. "Heard you were in Denver. Returned early when I heard Elijah Ashford's daughter had arrived." Jenkins dismounted, his 2 companions remaining on their horses. "Miss Ashford, I presume?" "I'm Henry Jenkins. I was sorry to hear about your father." Amelia stepped forward, her posture tense but composed. "Mr. Jenkins, I've been hoping to speak with you." "Indeed? Well, what a fortunate coincidence to find you here." Jenkins's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you've been asking questions about your father's mining claim." "Yes. In fact, I've just visited the Silverado today." Something hardened in Jenkins's expression. "Have you now? And what did you find in that worthless hole?" "Evidence that my father was correct in maintaining his investment," Amelia replied carefully. "The mine still holds promise." Jenkins exchanged glances with his companions. "Miss Ashford, I think we should discuss this in town, with proper legal representation. Mining claims can be complicated, especially when held by distant relatives with no experience in such matters." Thomas stepped closer to Amelia. "Any discussions can wait until morning." "Actually," Jenkins said, his tone hardening, "I'm afraid this matter requires immediate attention. Miss Ashford, if you'd be so kind as to gather your things." One of Jenkins's companions shifted in his saddle, pulling his coat back just enough to reveal a holstered pistol. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. "I believe Mr. Jenkins is right," Amelia said, her voice remarkably steady. "It would be best to resolve this properly." She turned to Thomas. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Keller." Thomas caught her arm gently as she moved to pass him. "You don't have to go with them." She met his eyes, and he saw both fear and determination there. "It's all right. We'll settle this legally." As Amelia gathered her few belongings from inside, Thomas approached Jenkins. "What's your game, Jenkins? That claim was worthless according to your own reports." Jenkins lowered his voice. "Stay out of this, Keller. This goes beyond a small silver deposit. If you harm her, don't be dramatic. This is business." Jenkins's smile was cold. "Though I am curious why the reclusive Thomas Keller suddenly takes such interest in an Eastern woman's affairs." Before Thomas could respond, Amelia emerged with her satchel. One of Jenkins's men dismounted to offer her his horse, and within minutes, they were riding away, leaving Thomas standing alone in the moonlight, filled with dread and a burning certainty that he couldn't let her face whatever was coming alone. Dawn found Thomas in Silver Peak, tying his horse outside the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Miller was pouring his morning coffee. "Keller? Don't usually see you in town twice in a week." The older man gestured to the coffee pot. "Want some?" "No time." Thomas leaned on the desk. "Jenkins returned yesterday and took Amelia Ashford, Professor Ashford's daughter, back to town after she visited her father's mine. Something's not right." Sheriff Miller sighed. "Jenkins is a company man. Nothing illegal about him discussing a claim with the heir. They were armed, and the invitation wasn't optional. Look, Keller, I understand your concern, but..." The door burst open, and Samuel from the saloon rushed in. "Sheriff, there's trouble at the hotel. Jenkins and his men are forcing Miss Ashford to sign papers." Thomas was moving before the sheriff could respond, striding quickly toward the Mountain View Hotel, with Miller hurrying to keep pace. In the hotel's small lobby, they found Amelia backed against the front desk, Jenkins and his 2 men standing over her. A document lay on the counter between them. "This is simple, Miss Ashford," Jenkins was saying. "Sign the transfer of claim, take the generous offer, and return east where you belong. And if I believe the claim is worth more than your offer?" Amelia's voice was steady despite her obvious distress. "Then you're as delusional as your father was." Jenkins leaned closer. "But unlike the professor, you don't have the luxury of returning to academic protection." "Step back, Jenkins." Thomas's voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned. Thomas stood in the doorway, the sheriff behind him. This is a private business matter, Jenkins said dismissively. Sheriff Miller moved forward. Not when it involves intimidation. Back away from the lady. She's refusing a fair offer for a worthless claim, Jenkins protested. I'm simply trying to save her from her father's folly. If it's worthless, why are you so eager to acquire it? Thomas asked, moving to Amelia's side. And why did you lie about being in Denver when she arrived? Amelia looked up at Thomas, relief evident in her eyes. There's more, she said. I reviewed my father's papers last night. The Silverado claim extends farther north than is recorded in the county office, including the ridge where the new railroad spur is planned. Understanding dawned on Thomas. The right-of-way payments would be substantial. Jenkins's face darkened. This is absurd. The girl knows nothing about mining or railroad affairs. I know enough about contracts to recognize fraud, Amelia replied, holding up the document from the desk. This transfer would sign away rights my father never would have relinquished, for 1/10 their value. Sheriff Miller took the paper from her. I think we need to examine these documents more carefully, and perhaps discuss why company men are pressuring a lady to sign papers without proper legal counsel. Jenkins glared at Thomas. You're making a mistake getting involved, Keller. Wouldn't be my first, Thomas replied evenly. Won't be my last. As Jenkins and his men were escorted to the sheriff's office for questioning, Thomas found himself alone with Amelia in the hotel lobby. Are you hurt? He asked, searching her face with concern. She shook her head. Only my pride. I should have been more cautious. Jenkins has powerful connections with the mining company and the railroad. Thomas frowned. This isn't over. I'm beginning to understand that. Amelia sighed, the strain of the morning evident in her posture. Thank you for coming. You didn't have to involve yourself in my troubles. Thomas hesitated, then spoke the truth that had been growing in him since their first meeting. I think I did. At her questioning look, he continued awkwardly. That is, I couldn't not come. When I saw them taking you away last night, something changed in her expression, a softening, a recognition. She reached out tentatively and touched his hand. I'm glad you did. The contact, simple as it was, sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the morning sun now streaming through the hotel windows. The following weeks brought dramatic changes to Silver Peak and to Thomas Keller's carefully ordered life. With the sheriff's intervention, Jenkins's attempt to defraud Amelia was exposed. Further investigation revealed he had been systematically altering claim boundaries in the county records, preparing for the railroad's arrival and the accompanying right-of-way payments. Amelia, with a determination that continually surprised the townspeople, chose not to sell the Silverado claim. Instead, with Thomas's reluctant agreement, they formed a partnership to reopen the mine, focusing on the gold vein they discovered. You understand this means staying in Silver Peak, Thomas said one evening as they reviewed their plans at his ranch. At least for months, possibly years. I understand. Amelia looked up from the papers spread across his table. Does that concern you? I'm concerned about your comfort. This isn't Boston. She smiled. I've noticed. And about your reputation, he added carefully. A woman in business partnership with a man. People will talk, she acknowledged. They already do. But I find I care less about that than I once did. Thomas studied her face in the lamplight. The weeks in Colorado had changed her. Her skin had taken on a sun-kissed glow, and she moved with the confidence of someone finding her place in the world. She wore simpler dresses now, practical for the mountain town, but somehow they only enhanced her natural beauty. What changed you? He asked suddenly. You could have taken Jenkins's offer, even after his deception was exposed, and returned to civilization. Instead, you're choosing to stay in a rough mining town with uncertain prospects. Amelia was quiet for a moment, considering. My father used to say that life's greatest discoveries often come when we're willing to look beyond the obvious path. She met Thomas's gaze steadily. I think perhaps I'm finally understanding what he meant. Her words stirred something in Thomas. Hope, possibility, and a terrifying vulnerability he'd spent years avoiding. The wall he'd built around his heart had developed cracks from the moment he'd seen her in the saloon. Now, it threatened to crumble entirely. As autumn painted the mountains in vibrant color, work began at the Silverado. Thomas hired 4 experienced miners, men he'd worked with years before and trusted. Amelia surprised everyone with her knowledge of geology and her willingness to learn the practical aspects of mining operations. She moved from the hotel to a small cabin closer to the mine, one that Thomas and the miners helped repair and make suitable for her. The partnership worked better than either had anticipated. Thomas brought practical experience and earned the respect of the miners, while Amelia's scientific understanding guided their exploration of the new vein. Their different approaches complemented each other, creating something neither could have accomplished alone. Yet as their professional relationship thrived, the unspoken connection between them grew increasingly difficult to ignore. Thomas found himself looking for reasons to visit her cabin in the evenings, bringing reports from the mine, discussing supply needs, or simply sharing news from town. Amelia seemed equally eager for his company, often having coffee brewing when he arrived, as if she'd been expecting him. One crisp October evening, Thomas arrived to find Amelia sitting on her small porch, wrapped in a woolen shawl and gazing at the stars. "Beautiful night," he said, climbing the steps to join her. "It is." She smiled warmly. "I was just thinking how different the stars look here, so much brighter than in Boston. Less smoke and city lights to dim them." Thomas agreed, settling beside her on the bench. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the distant sounds of the forest their only company. "I received a letter today," Amelia said finally, "from my father's colleague at Harvard. He's offering me a position as his assistant." Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "In Boston?" She nodded. "He says my father would have wanted me to continue his research." "Would you want that?" Thomas asked carefully, afraid of the answer, yet needing to know. Amelia turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. 6 months ago, it would have seemed the perfect opportunity. Now, she hesitated. "Now I find myself reluctant to leave what we've started here." "The mine?" Thomas asked, hope and fear battling within him. "Not just the mine." Her voice grew softer. "Thomas, I've come to care for this place. For the people here." She met his eyes. "For you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. "Amelia, Thomas began, then stopped, the words tangling in his throat. She waited, patient but vulnerable. When he didn't continue, something like disappointment flickered across her face. "It's all right. I understand that you value your independence. I wouldn't want to presume." "No," he interrupted, finding his voice at last. "That's not it. I've spent years believing that caring for someone meant eventually losing them. That the only way to survive out here was to depend on no one. And now," she asked softly. "Now I'm terrified," he admitted. "Because I care for you more than I thought possible. And the thought of you leaving." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Amelia reached out, her fingers gently touching his face. "I'm not leaving, Thomas. Not unless you want me to." In the silver moonlight, with the mountains standing silent witness, Thomas finally surrendered the battle he'd been fighting since the moment he'd first seen her. He leaned forward and kissed her, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I never believed I could feel this way about anyone." "Nor I," she whispered. "It seems we've both made unexpected discoveries." Their newfound happiness, however, was short-lived. 1 week later, disaster struck the Silverado. Thomas was checking supplies at the mine entrance when he heard a rumble from deep within the mountain. Seconds later, 2 miners stumbled out, coughing and covered in dust. "Cave in," one shouted. The south tunnel collapsed. Thomas's blood ran cold. "Where's Amelia?" And the others? Miss Ashford was showing Patterson and Martinez the new section we opened yesterday, the miner gasped. "Behind the collapse." Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed a lantern and rushed into the mine, ignoring the warnings about aftershocks. The main shaft was still intact, but when he reached the junction where the south tunnel began, he found a wall of fallen rock and timber. "Amelia," he shouted, pressing against the debris. "Can you hear me?" For an agonizing moment, there was no response. Then, faintly from the other side, "Thomas? We're trapped." Relief surged through him at the sound of her voice. "Are you hurt?" "No, just some cuts and bruises. Patterson's leg is pinned, but Martinez is helping him." "I'll get you out," Thomas promised, already assessing the collapse. "Save your lamp oil. And watch for gas." The next 12 hours were a desperate race against time. Thomas organized the miners and volunteers from town into shifts, carefully removing rubble while bracing the tunnel to prevent further collapse. The mountain seemed to resist their efforts, settling ominously at intervals and forcing them to retreat. As evening approached, Sheriff Miller arrived at the mine. Jenkins left town this morning, he reported grimly, right after visiting the assay office. Thomas paused in his work. What did he learn? That your latest samples showed the richest gold content seen in this county in a decade. The implication was clear. You think he sabotaged the mine? Miller shrugged. No proof. But the timing's suspicious. Thomas felt rage burn through him, but pushed it aside. Vengeance would have to wait. Right now, only one thing mattered. Near midnight, they finally broke through, creating an opening large enough to pass through. Thomas was the first one in, crawling through the narrow gap with a fresh lantern. The scene beyond made his heart stutter. The air was thick with dust, and part of the ceiling had collapsed further into the chamber. Amelia sat beside Patterson, whose leg was trapped beneath a timber. Martinez stood guard over them, wielding a pickaxe as a makeshift support for a sagging roof beam. Thomas. Amelia's voice was hoarse from the dust, but her eyes shone with relief in the lantern light. He rushed to her side, fighting the urge to gather her in his arms. Instead, he quickly examined Patterson's injury. We need to move this timber carefully. His legs crushed, but not severed. With Martinez's help, they managed to free Patterson and get him through the opening. Then Martinez followed, leaving Thomas and Amelia alone in the damaged chamber. You're hurt, Thomas said, noticing a gash on her forehead for the first time. It's nothing. She swayed slightly as she stood, betraying her exhaustion. This time Thomas didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. I thought I'd lost you. She clung to him, her body trembling with delayed shock. I knew you'd come. Always, he whispered into her hair. But we need to get out of here. The mountain's still restless. As if to emphasize his point, a low groan echoed through the chamber, and more dust filtered down from above. They moved quickly toward the opening, Thomas helping Amelia through first. He was halfway through himself when the mountain shifted again. Thomas felt rather than saw the roof collapsing behind him. With a desperate surge, he pushed through the opening just as the chamber he'd vacated filled with rubble. The force of the collapse sent him tumbling forward, and pain exploded along his left side as a falling rock struck his shoulder. When he regained his senses, he was outside the mine, lying on a blanket with Amelia kneeling beside him, her face streaked with tears and dust. Don't you dare leave me now, she was saying, her voice fierce despite its tremor. Not when I've just found you. Thomas managed a weak smile. Not planning to. The injury, though painful, proved less severe than initially feared. The town doctor diagnosed a broken collarbone and 3 cracked ribs. Painful, but not life-threatening. Recovery would take weeks, however, leaving Thomas unable to work at the mine or his ranch. Amelia refused to leave his side, moving temporarily into his cabin to care for him despite the inevitable gossip such an arrangement caused in town. She divided her time between tending to Thomas, managing the mine repairs, and investigating Jenkins's suspected sabotage. You should rest, Thomas told her one evening as she returned from the mine, exhaustion evident in her movements. You're doing too much, says the man who tried to get out of bed yesterday to check on the cattle. She retorted, but her smile softened the words. As Thomas recovered, their relationship deepened. Long conversations filled the evenings about their pasts, their hopes, the future they might build together. The physical intimacy between them remained chaste but grew increasingly tender. Shared touches, gentle kisses, the comfort of simply being close. By early December, Thomas was well enough to move about the cabin freely, though heavy work remained impossible. Snow had begun to blanket the mountains, slowing the mine repairs but creating a crystalline beauty across the landscape. One clear, cold evening, Thomas stood on his porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered peaks in pink and gold. Amelia joined him, slipping her arm through his good one. Beautiful, she murmured. Yes, he agreed, looking not at the mountains but at her. The setting sun caught the auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, and her cheeks were flushed from the kitchen's warmth. She caught his gaze and smiled. What are you thinking? That I never expected any of this, he admitted. The mine, the partnership. He hesitated, then added softly, you. Life rarely follows the path we expect, she said. My father taught me that. He was a wise man. Thomas took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the twinge in his ribs. Amelia, I need to ask you something important. She turned to face him fully, her expression curious. These past months, since the cave-in, you've been managing everything. The mine, the ranch, my recovery. You've proven you don't need anyone to succeed here. I never claimed to need you, Thomas, she said gently. I choose to be with you. There's a difference. I know. He smiled. And that makes what I'm about to ask even more difficult. Taking her hand in his, he continued. I've spent years believing I needed no one. That caring for others only led to pain. You changed that. You made me realize that a life without connection isn't really living at all. Understanding dawned in Amelia's eyes as Thomas awkwardly lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hand. I can't offer you Boston society or academic halls. Just a small ranch, a recovering mind, and a man who loves you more than he thought possible. His voice grew husky with emotion. Amelia Ashford, will you marry me? Tears glistened in her eyes, catching the last light of sunset. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Thomas Keller. I will marry you. He rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise he felt. When they finally parted, she laughed softly. What? He asked, smiling at her joy. I was just remembering something. That first day in the saloon, when you intervened with that miner. You looked at me across the room, and for the briefest moment, I felt as though I'd known you all my life. Thomas's heart quickened at her words. I felt it too. Like recognition. She rested her head against his chest. Do you believe two souls can know each other, even upon first meeting? I never did before, he admitted. But now, he tilted her face up to his. Now I believe many things I once thought impossible. As snowflakes began to fall gently around them, Thomas drew her back into the warmth of the cabin, the home they now shared and would continue to share for the rest of their lives. The wedding took place on Christmas Day in Silver Peak's small church. The entire town attended, curious to witness the union of the reserved rancher and the Eastern professor's daughter who had defied expectations to make a life in the mountains. Amelia wore a dress of deep blue velvet, with a wreath of winter evergreens in her hair instead of the traditional veil. Thomas, standing nervously at the altar in his best suit, felt his breath catch when she appeared at the church doors. As she walked toward him, escorted by Sheriff Miller who had offered to stand in for her father, Thomas remembered their first meeting in the saloon months ago. The strange sense of recognition, the immediate connection he'd felt, the certainty that somehow, against all reason, she was meant to be part of his life. When she reached him, he took her hands in his and spoke the words that had been growing in his heart since that first moment. I knew you were mine from the first moment I saw you. Amelia's smile illuminated her entire face. And I knew you were mine. In the years that followed, the Silverado mine produced enough gold to make them comfortable, though never wealthy. Thomas expanded his ranch, and together they built a larger home overlooking the valley. They welcomed 2 children, a son who inherited his father's quiet strength and a daughter with her mother's keen intelligence and determination. The frontier remained challenging, with harsh winters, occasional droughts, and the constant work required to maintain their life in the mountains. But the difficulties only strengthened the bond between them. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Amelia back to the spot where they'd first discovered the gold vein in the Silverado, now a properly supported tunnel in a successful mine. 10 years, he marveled, holding the lantern high. Sometimes it seems impossible that so much has changed, and yet some things remain constant. Amelia replied, slipping her hand into his. Like how I feel when you look at me. Thomas smiled, remembering the frightened young widower he'd been, determined to need no one. I once thought loving someone was the greatest risk a man could take. And now? She asked, though she knew the answer. Now I know it's the only thing that makes the risk of living worthwhile. He drew her close, his voice dropping to a whisper. I knew you were mine from the first moment, Amelia Keller. And I thank God every day that you are. As they emerged from the mine into the mountain sunshine, Thomas looked at the life they'd built together, the home visible in the distance, the healthy mine, the ranch where their children played. He had once believed the frontier was no place for love, that a man could only survive by remaining alone and untouched. How wrong he had been. It wasn't despite the frontier's hardships that their love had flourished, but because of them. Each challenge faced together had strengthened their bond. Each victory shared had deepened their connection. Thomas Keller, who had once built walls to keep the world at bay, had found his greatest strength in the woman who had helped him tear them down. And in doing so, he had discovered that the true frontier wasn't the wild landscape around them, but the endless possibility of two hearts joining to face whatever life might bring.